Hello, everyone. Kia ora koutou. From wherever you may be joining us today across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, it's my pleasure to say good morning or good afternoon and welcome. My name is Simon Paulson and I'm the Executive Director of NASLA, National and State Libraries Australasia. I'm joining you today from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which we call Sydney and which is home for me, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders, past and present. I'm also joined today behind the scenes by my colleagues Abby, Amy and Joe, and together we work across Australia and New Zealand. And on my colleagues' behalf and on behalf of NASLA, I pay my respects to the traditional custodians and kaitiaki of the many lands on which we live and on which our libraries do their daily work, preserving and sharing our collective cultural heritage. For those unfamiliar, NASLA is a collaboration between 10 libraries, the National, State and Territory Libraries of Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand. NASLA has been collaborating for more than 50 years to share knowledge, resources and expertise to advance our libraries. And through our collective action, our vision is to create long-term benefits for our libraries and our communities. Many staff across NASLA libraries contribute to the important cultural heritage platforms of Trove, built by the National Library of Australia, and Digital Pacific and Digital NZ, built by the National Library of Aotearoa, New Zealand. These platforms are the focus of today's webinar, and we will explore how each of these platforms are transforming how communities access and interact with historical archives, including empowering communities to contribute knowledge to collections, to correct inaccuracies, and to curate collections together to tell new personal and community stories. Participating in today's webinar are Rachel Essen, National Librarian at the National Library of New Zealand, Kelly Dix, Online Engagement Manager at Digital NZ, and Tapatukura Raiea, Program Manager at Pacific Virtual Museum. Kelly and Tapatu will share their work with Digital NZ and Digital Pacific, along with stories from the users engaging with these platforms. Following this, Jenny Ostini, Director of Trove Community Services, will speak. And finally, we'll conclude with a Q&A session, which will be facilitated by Tim Kong, Director of Digital Experience at the National Library of New Zealand. So this is a full program, and before we start, my most important message is to make sure that you, who are both audience and participants in this webinar, make use of the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen throughout this session. Do use the Q&A feature to ask your questions and to upvote other people's questions. Please also keep an eye on the chat where my NASLA colleagues will post useful links and information. So I now introduce Rachel Essen, Te Puhuaki, Te Puna Mautoronga au Aotearoa, National Librarian of New Zealand and Director and Chair of National and State Libraries Australasia, to welcome us and to begin our webinar. Rachel, kia ora.
Kia ora. And just give me one moment while I pull up my presentation, which I practiced earlier, and hopefully that's all working now. Kia ora koutou, talofa lava, kia orana, malalole, bulavanaka, warm Pacific greetings. Kia tangi no mai te kihi punamu. Ko Manawatu, te Manawarahi, Manawatu, te kai whakamaru. Kia raro iho o ona mata ki nga ringa o otu mātua, no reira ko Rachel tōku ingoa, ko te Pohuaki o te puna mātaranga o Aotearoa tāku mahi, no te papa oia aho, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a pleasure to be here today to introduce and open this webinar. And I'm doing that from Whanganui Atara, from Wellington, Aotearoa. And as Simon has said, thank you for that introduction, Simon, that I'm here in my role as NSLA Chair. And also, I am delighted that a number of kaimahi from National Library Aotearoa are presenting. So I'm looking forward to that. But I am declaring up front that I am not an expert in this field. I think my main qualification for providing reflections about this topic is my advanced age and the length of time that I've worked in libraries. And what you can see here in this photograph is an office in London in 1989. I'm looking a little bit younger there, and with some colleagues, Diane and Gurnham. I worked at the National Communications Union, and having just completed my library qualification, I felt that I was suitably qualified to install their first computerized payroll system. When I look back now, I think I feel quite horrified, and I think the cheek of it. Um, However, it was quite similar to database library management systems, so I knew a little bit about those. But the other thing about working in an office in London in the late 80s was that, as well as smoking being allowed in the office, it was also perfectly acceptable to drink at your desk during the day, which is why you can see a bottle of wine on there, on the desk there. Anyway, the point of all of this is to remind us of just how far we have come, how much our systems and access to information has evolved in the past few decades. Pre-internet, research at our national and state libraries would have involved a physical visit, searching a card catalogue, and sometimes the experience being a little like searching for the proverbial needle. Of course, all of that has changed dramatically. First, accessing databases via dial-up. I'm not sure if any of you remember that, how you had to carefully plan your search before you dialed in to search. CD-ROMs, online journals, and online databases. We started to digitize our library and archival collections. And then, as things have evolved, we have the development of online digital portals like Trove, Digital Pacific, and Digital New Zealand. They now mean that the collections of our libraries and the many others that we partner with are available to anyone, anywhere, at any time. The collections that are discoverable through these platforms are from a large range of institutions and organisations, including museums, local libraries, universities, government departments, community groups, and many more. Collectively, via Trove and Digital Pacific and DNZ, there are over 14 billion digital items accessible. And the context that Abby helpfully suggested for understanding that vast number is that if each digital item was a person, that is nearly twice the entire global population. This content is accessed by over 20 million people each year: students, researchers, authors, teachers, family historians, etc. And the range of formats accessible is astounding: books, manuscripts, newspapers, photographs, maps, data sets, music scores, oral histories, the list goes on. The collections include items that reflect unique Australasian experiences, from wartime rationing to COVID-19 QR code sign-in posters. And the important thing is that all of this collecting and making accessible is about connection and benefiting the communities that we serve. Not just the communities that we serve now, but our communities in the future. And to ensure that we can continue to connect and provide this vast and rich content, we need to keep focusing. We need to keep innovating and improving our infrastructure and our services. We need to keep connecting with those who generate the content and those accessing it now and whose mokopuna or descendants will access it in the future. The kaimahi that we will hear from today will be talking about the power of community engagement to enable community-driven curation. When communities are empowered to contribute their knowledge in relevant and appropriate ways, the stories and the histories that are shared are deeper and richer for all. And so that's enough from me. You need time to hear from the experts. I'd like to thank the NSLA team for putting this webinar together, and in particular to Abby for wrangling us. And I know that you're looking forward to hearing from the smart and dedicated people that we have lined up to share with you today. They are representative of the extensive work that's been done across our organisations to partner with communities in all that we do. Ngā mihi nui, enjoy the afternoon. Kia ora.
Thank you, Rachel, for sharing those insights, and especially that personal story taking us back to London in the 1980s, and may I say perhaps the earlier days of computers. It's a reminder of how far we've come, not just in welcome advances in things like prohibitions on smoking indoors, but of course, more importantly, in extraordinary advances in online digital portals. When I began, I welcomed our audience across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, but can see in the chat that actually we welcome guests today from all over the world. So welcome especially to those joining us from beyond our region. To continue the conversation about these portals and platforms, I now introduce Kelly Dix, Digital NZ Online Engagement Manager at the National Library of New Zealand, who will speak about how Digital NZ supports Aotearoa New Zealand's New Histories curriculum. Kelly, kia ora.
Kia ora. Kia ora koutou, ko Kelly Dix aho. I am the Online Engagement Manager at Digital New Zealand at Tihi Aotearoa. Thank you for coming along today. I'm talking to you from Te Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington, and I'm going to talk to you about Digital New Zealand and one of its important communities, schools and kura. Digital NZ is a platform designed to make digital heritage content easy to find, share and use. Digital NZ aggregates over 30 million items from more than 240 content partners, including libraries, museums, galleries, government departments, media and community groups. Content partners range from large national organisations like Te Papa and the National Library, and also smaller collections such as Te Arahi Districts Museum in Niwa. We have recently welcomed Warkworth Museum, The Sapling and Pantograph Punch to Digital NZ. Digital NZ is not a repository. We don't hold items, but by harvesting collection metadata, we point people out to digital collections around the country and overseas. All items in Digital NZ include a link back to the source of the content, so it's easy to find where items come from. Since digitalnz.org went live in December 2008, we have grown exponentially. We bring in new content partners on a regular basis. Their collections are growing as they digitise new items, and the number of people using Digital NZ increases every month. One audience that is increasingly engaging with Digital NZ are school and kura communities. Until a refreshed social sciences curriculum was mandated in 2023, New Zealand's own history was not always taught in schools. In 2014, a group of students from Otorohanga College visited nearby Rangiawhia and learned for the first time of the attack in 1864 on the unfortified Maori village by British troops. The visit had a profound effect on the students, who started a petition calling for a day of commemoration for the New Zealand Wars and for New Zealand history to be taught in schools. In September 2019, almost 4 years after the students presented their petition to Parliament, the government announced that New Zealand history would be taught in all schools and kura by 2022. Prime Minister Ardern said in her speech, "A country's history, its painstaking origins, its unique stories, their telling should never be left to chance." When the refreshed curriculum was introduced, there was an opportunity for school communities to focus learning on local histories. That is, learning about the land or the whenua a school was built on, the experiences of people who lived there over generations, and the events that took place there. In an article for the online news website The Spin-Off, primary school teacher Jessie Moss wrote that beginning with local histories makes sense. Tamariki, or children, are necessarily self-centered. Their understanding of the world and their connections to it grows as they do. What has been missing in schools is all tamariki knowing the specific histories of where they live and learn and what that means for their communities today. The Histories curriculum content was introduced in 2021, and although welcomed by teachers and students, it was clear that there was a lack of resources to both upskill teachers who mostly didn't learn New Zealand history as part of their own education, and also resources to use with their own students. In a staff room survey report commissioned by the Ministry of Education, teachers identified the main resources they use to teach history and need more of in the future. These resources included access to content that is relevant and local. So we are thrilled that schools in Kura are using Digital NZ to access resources for teaching and learning Aotearoa New Zealand histories. You can see this use if you take a look at the top search terms on Digital NZ in Google Analytics. This is from January to August 2024. You can see key events in our history, Bastion Point, Parihaka, Dawn Raids, and if you take a look at the long tail of search terms, then you notice that a number of searches are for places all over New Zealand. You can also see use by schools in Kura in analytics tracking our most visited stories. This one is about the Māori land hikoi in 1975. Another popular story is about women in the workforce during World War II. As well as searching Digital NZ, school communities are creating their own stories. One type of use is school librarians and teachers creating stories to gather together resources for student research. This is a story about Titi Torea. You can see that the teacher has added their own text as well as photos from archives, Te Papa and Auckland libraries. Teachers and school librarians have also created stories about their own schools, such as this one by Sylvia Park School. They have added captions providing context for students about each item, but the item's original title and partner organisation are still visible on the item card. You can also add your own image to a story. You can see examples in this story about Wanganui City College. The school has uploaded photos from its own archive, photos that are not in Digital New Zealand, but are showing in the story alongside photos from Auckland libraries. Access to a story can be set by the author to public, hidden, or private. Using the hidden setting may be useful if you want to limit access to a class or to a school community, for example. Students are also using the story tool to present their research and learning. This is a story by a senior student who has created a digital resource for younger students to learn about Te Tiriti and also the New Zealand Wars. Students are also creating stories where they are assessing the credibility of source material. This is a screenshot from a story about the Ballantyne's department store fire in 1947. The student has identified whether each item is a primary or a secondary resource, the reliability of the source, and whether it was useful or not to help them answer their research questions. Although we are proud of the role that Digital NZ plays connecting schools in Kura with digitised heritage collections, we also need to be aware of the bias created by the very nature of libraries and museums as Western knowledge institutions. Going forward, we need to continue to work with our content partner organisations to consider what items can be shared and how they should be described and disseminated. We also need to support iwi and hapu with resources to tell their own histories in Pirako, being acutely aware that these are the same histories and knowledge frameworks that were oppressed and reframed during colonisation. I am hopeful that as students learn more about New Zealand histories, they will also learn to think critically and identify perspectives and bias in both primary and secondary source material. At the same time, Digital NZ will continue to work with our content partner organisations to facilitate access to heritage collections for our audiences, including tamariki in our schools and kura. Kia ora, and thank you for listening today. The case study that follows shows how one school is using Digital NZ to teach the Aotearoa New Zealand History's curriculum content.
Kia ora koutou. I'm Debbie Roxburgh and I'm a capability facilitator with Services to Schools, Te Puna Mātauranga o Aotearoa, the National Library of New Zealand. Joining me today is Martin Dravitsky, a history teacher from Francis Douglas Memorial College, a Year 7 to 13 secondary school in New Plymouth. Welcome, Martin, and thank you for making time to talk to us today. Martin, you and your students have been using Digital New Zealand for some years now. Can you tell us what you've observed about how students approach creating their own Digital New Zealand stories?
Yeah, kia ora, Debbie. It's been like a lot of the old thing about it being a journey. I've been using it, I can't remember exactly how long, but perhaps 10 years. And originally simply as a resource, but over time it's become more integrated into our overall history program. So that from year 9 and 10 social studies, we begin using it to access primary data around topics such as local history, that sort of thing. And then just the nature of what sources are, and then we build it through the program till year 13. But the stories takes the biggest part in the level 2 curriculum.
Right.
Where I'm using it as part of the 2.1 standard, which is the research standard.
Okay.
And as part of that, the students are required, as part of their assessment, to create a Digital NZ story. They're not new, most of them are not new to it because they've done it at 9, 10, 11
Right.
coming through, but we talk about then how they will use it later on. But it forms one of the tasks within that assessment standard.
Okay. So, Martin, does that process of creating stories shape students' understanding of historical events and help them engage with different perspectives?
Yep, it certainly does. I mean, we're in as I'm sure we all know, a brave new world. And so things are changing even within the space of this last 10 years.
Right.
So it was fantastic. It was very exciting to be able to have a resource that we could on hand in a classroom using the laptops, be able to access those sources rather than have to search for them outside of the room. But we've moved on to the point where now it's not just finding those sources, it's what we do with them, how we evaluate them, how we structure the whole process around them. Yeah,
I'm wondering whether students developing their own stories actually helps students feel more connected to their own local histories.
Well, it's certainly one of the intentions. I do it at different levels. I won't take you through every level, but ideas of when we first introduce it, I first introduce it to them, they look for their own family. So we do it as part of a family history type thing at year 9 or sometimes year 10. And so they're able to search up their own families.
Right.
And that's good for some, but of course for others, they don't, recent migrants, for example, there's not so much there.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I can see that you're actually scaffolding students through that process of using Digital New Zealand right from the time that you first meet them in year 9.
Yeah. The weakness, I'd say, would be, however, that there is a lack of pre-European.
Right.
Obviously.
Yep.
So we're still struggling with trying to come up with a cohesive local histories,
Right.
For because we'd like to do a lot more of that.
Mhm.
I'd like to do a lot more of that, but it's difficult to get.
It's finding the material, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's partly going to where my next question might be going around topics or events that, well, you've identified where some challenges are. I'm wondering whether there are topics or events in New Zealand histories that you've found Digital New Zealand particularly useful for.
Yes, well, the one that I think we've got some examples of is the New Zealand tragedies, which we do at level 2.
Mm-hmm.
And that forms their research and also their significant impact standard, so 2.1, 2.2.
Mm-hmm.
Some years I don't do the 2.2, I use a different topic. But it's ideal there because there is a real primary source slant to it. Another area we use it in is at level 1, where we look at the Great Migration in the 1870s, and students, as part of their research tasks, break down passenger lists of each kid gets their own ship, their own passenger list.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm.
And then they are able to use the Digital NZ search to find articles about the ship's arrival,
Right.
what happened, whether there was anything unusual. There's also some quite good stuff from Hansard's, in one or two of the cases there is some interesting journey stories that then have to be reported on once they arrive here. So it's very good in that regard.
Right, it really helps students really create that a more complete picture of what was going on at that time. So Digital NZ provides access to thousands of primary sources in one location. Do you find that's changing the way that students approach historical research? Perhaps, I don't know whether I'll say compared to more traditional methods or compared to their perhaps preferred Googling approach?
Yep, it is. We use it when I first introduce it to them, and then I re-emphasise this every year with them, that it's Digital NZ as a portal as opposed to a search engine.
Right.
And the idea that it's connected to a lot of live databases throughout the country, and that keeps growing. And so it's not just a static.
It's that idea of it not being finite, is it? That there will always be more, it's evolving.
And a lot of them don't really understand how these things are structured. So Digital NZ is quite good, and the way it's shaped, you can actually see it quite clearly when you show it to them. Whereas Google, some of these other ones, some of the AI tools, there's really no back end that they can't see, and they don't really care. They don't really care, but most of them don't. So it's important that they understand how that goes. So you can take them through the search. You can bring up various bits of information and show them how that's happening, which I find a very useful tool within it.
Right. Now, this is starting to feels like the big question. It's been said that stories feature in Digital New Zealand has the potential to change how future generations understand, relate to, and perhaps even challenge the dominant narratives of New Zealand history. How would you respond to that statement?
Ooh, that's a biggie.
It is.
You get out what you put in. And so in terms of the dominant narratives, there needs to be, say, if we're looking at pre-European or iwi-based, Purukau, all that sort of stuff, it's going to have to be in there for people to access it.
Right.
And so where those databases come from, and this is the issue we find at the moment, and I'm sure this is across the country and probably outside of New Zealand as well, is Indigenous stories are in the process of being not created, but being recorded and being put in a format that can be delivered.
Yep.
And we're only at the beginning point of that. So in terms of balance, it's a great tool for. It's going to come down to. It's not going to replace teaching. It's going to come down to how the teachers use that to give a balance.
I was going to say, I mean, that's the crunch, isn't it? You can find material, but it's the way you use it and analyse and interpret, and then ultimately, I guess, with your students, curate material. That's actually going to shape how the learning, or how effective the learning is.
Yeah. At the level 2, the 2.1 that I do, basically what we're asking the students is to collect, categorise, and curate.
Right.
So around, say they've got the Napier earthquake or the, I use the Wahine disaster as one we all do together.
Mm-hmm.
Then they all get their own individual for their assessment. So they select the Mount Tarawera eruption, something like that. And they have to collect it, certainly, but then they've got to do something with it. What we're trying to get them to do is then say, well, these are primary, these are secondary, these are, this is a key source, this is a contributing source, this can't be necessarily trusted because...
Right.
And then put it together in some sort of cohesive format, which the story is good because it gives you pretty much an empty box for them to do that within.
Oh, I mean, exactly. And so, I mean, really right throughout that process, you're really talking about students developing those critical literacy skills and being able to actually form opinions and so on with what they find. Martin, just in conclusion, I'm wondering whether you have a pearl of wisdom or advice that you would give to librarians or educators who are just starting their journey using the Stories feature of Digital New Zealand?
I'm very fortunate we have a good relationship with our librarian, but getting them involved as just simply in terms of what you're doing and keeping librarians connected and in the conversation. So when I'm talking with the kids about where you find your information, it would be very easy to just say, go to Digital NZ and it's all there, or go, but we keep that relationship strong and say, well, I'm telling you this, but if you go to the librarian, they may well be able to give you something that I haven't got.
And I think, you've probably made everyone glad, Martin, because that's exactly how librarians really see themselves, that we're an and rather than an either or. And together, that's where the strength comes in actually helping students find information and really begin effective search journeys.
Yeah.
Martin, thank you so much for giving up part of your holiday to talk to me about this.
Okay.
And enjoy the rest of your break.
I'm sure I shall.
Thanks heaps.
Thank you to Kelly, especially for sharing the story that spoke so powerfully about the value of Digital NZ. And thank you as well for Debbie Roxburgh and Martin Dravitsky for reminding us of the powerful things that can happen when people like the students that you mentioned are given access to knowledge and information, especially about their past. I invite now Tapatukura Raiea, Program Manager for the Pacific Virtual Museum, to share her experience about building participation in a user contribution feature. Kia ora.
Kia ora. One moment. Cool. Kia ora tātou kātoto te roa mā te tētoa I teia rā au. Tōku ingoa ko Tapatukura Raiea no Mauke I Pāmati mai au. I anganga au I roto I te tupuna mātauranga o Aotearoa, te Program Manager TTO. Kia ora everyone, my name is Tatsu and I'm the Program Manager for the Digital Pacific website. And today I'll be sharing how objects and stories connect and how we're doing this with our website. So Pacific culture is an oral tradition of storytelling. It allows us to understand our identity, our practices, our cultural traditions. But what happens when we don't have access to these traditions, cultural practices, our tools, our photographs, and our historical records? How will our future generations know how we lived, what we were like, and even where we lived? In the years to come, will our island homes still be around due to climate change and rising sea levels? And if not, how is the memory of our homes going to be shared?
So these are only a fraction of institutions that hold Pacific collections around the world. They hold significant cultural artifacts and objects from the Pacific. Although they may have some of the Pacific collections on display and available online, the majority of these collections have yet to be digitised. So a significant part of Pacific history and culture is inaccessible for the people it belongs to. For our Pacific people, finding who you are related to, which is Akapapaanga and Cook Islands, which is our genealogy, and Enua, which is our land, is an integral part of our cultural identity. But there are many challenges when trying to access these records. If they haven't been digitised, having to travel to see these collections in person, inaccuracies with the metadata when trying to search our systems, or often many of our people don't know that these collections and records exist because they don't have connections with the institutions, and the institutions don't know how to connect with them. Which brings us to the Uto model, which is the growing seed of coconut. This model was developed by my previous engagement manager, Matirini Ngari, and myself to help explain our role as Digital Pacific as the connectors. At the centre of the uto is the fruit, which is the spongy marshmallow part of the coconut, which we class as Pacific culture. This is the centre of our work. The next part of the uto is the kātinga, which is the white flesh. This is Pacific communities. They are the holders and practitioners of the culture and why they're the closest part to the fruit. The next part is the upuakari, which is a hard outer shell. This is Pacific Glam sector. They offer a layer of protection and preservation of Pacific culture and have connections with their communities to best understand traditional protocols, but often have limited resources to make their collections available online. The next part is us, Digital Pacific, and we are the inner husk. This is the part of the uto that Pacific people use to make sinnet lashings, to bind houses, and outriggers. As Digital Pacific, we are the connectors. We connect Pacific communities to their taonga or their treasures, the Pacific land sector that might not have the resources, and our international glam sector that doesn't have connections with Pacific communities. The next part is our outward husk, which is our international glam sector. They are outside of the Pacific and they hold significant Pacific collections. They protect and preserve, but often don't have connections with Pacific communities that hold the knowledge. And our last part of the uto is the shu, which is our Pacific learners and creatives. They are the ones that allow the culture to live on. When all of us are connected, they have the opportunity to flourish. And as Digital Pacific, we feel the responsibility to connect all parties to ensure that Pacific culture will grow and be passed on to future generations. So we are fortunate to be funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia since 2020, when the website was launched. This project is implemented by the National Library of New Zealand with the support of National Library of Australia. So we have developed a website that makes Pacific culture and heritage visible and accessible for the people in and of the Pacific. So we share content for 32 Pacific islands and over 909 content partners with over 530,000 plus items available. So over the past 4 years, we've been making connections with institutions that hold these collections and partnering with them to make their collections available on our website. As Digital Pacific, we've been connecting Pacific communities with their cultural heritage and allowing them in spaces where they don't often visit. We have hosted several Pacific community events connecting to collections and inviting Pacific people to view, touch, and connect with long lost artifacts, often always finding something that connects them to their ancestors. But to invite them into these spaces, this takes a lot of work to be able to find these communities and build relationships with them. Ensuring you have the contacts with the community to build these meaningful relationships and scheduling visits that work for communities, advertising on platforms that they use, including like Facebook. Cultural protocols are also included in the event. So ensuring that you have a minister to open it up, and also providing kai or food. So when the event is organised right, what you would see is communities' willingness to share their knowledge, grateful that we have these facilities and resources to look after the treasures, importance that people are willing to listen to them and the knowledge that they do have, and that generational knowledge transfer, younger generations wanting to learn more about their culture, ongoing connections with the institution, and curators learn more about the items too. But how can we replicate this for other communities that can't visit collections in person? And how can sharing stories and knowledge be an ongoing opportunity? Which is our website. Through Digital Pacific, collections are now available just a few searches and clicks. As part of the website, we know how important it is for communities to be able to share their own narrative, correct metadata, and find family ties. And we have allowed this for all items on our website, the opportunity to share stories through our user contributions feature. We can now connect isolated villages digitally to their cultural heritage if they have access to the internet, so that they can share their own stories and allowing them to narrate their own experiences living in their homes. Another video. We have 124 user contributions. For this feature, you don't need to set up an account. The only information we do take from our users is their email, and they can choose whether their name is presented. We don't do any moderation on the stories. Once they submit, it goes live on our website. And we have a wide range of stories and topics shared on the collections, and which I will highlight just a few. So the first one, so this is an image titled Afu, and it's held at Te Papa and part of the George Crummer collection from 1909. But not much else is known about this image. And so this is a contribution from a Pacific historian who shares this may be her ancestor Ana Pataripo, and that she's shared this image with her aunties and uncles to confirm. If it is her ancestor, she states when he migrated to Rarotonga, how many children he had and who ties to him, and how many Vaini Māori, which is Cook Island women, leased land to him. But this is never really mentioned in the records, she states. And I'm going to share another one. So this is another record from the New York Public Library of Awaroa, Rarotonga, Cook Islands. I think I'm a bit biased by sharing most of the Cook Island records. And this photograph was taken in 1913. And so in 2021, I held a Connecting to Collection session with the community in Rarotonga and shared this image and just asked them to shout out what they knew about it. So from what they shouted at me, I just recorded it and typed it as a user contribution. And so from this session, they were able to name the traditional names of the mountains in the background over here, and what families used to live in this area, and the old shops that used to be there as well. And I think this was a great session for the community to learn about this area from each other. So the next one is, this video is from the Nganga family farm in Fiji and Waianae, Cook Island. And they share songs they often sang when in their plantation. And this video is from one of our partners called Coconut TV. And so this guest has written this story in Vosavakaviti in the Fijian language, sharing their experience living in the village where everyone helps each other with their crops. We also have a feature where if any contributions are offensive, other users can report it, just over here. And we rely on our users to do this if the contributions are in a different language. So no one has yet to report a contribution, which is really good. And so why is it important to share? To allow history to be corrected, Indigenous cultures and names to be recognised, improves metadata, collections are more discoverable, brings context to the images and objects. but also makes these collections more discoverable for future generations. And we have added another feature recently that these stories and words that are used by the contributors are now searchable on our website. So it brings more context, and the names and the items are more discoverable by our communities. So what stories do you have to share? And I will stop my share. And I'm going to introduce the case study, which was a pre-recording by Stacey Kokua-Balfa. So this presentation was part of a Weaving a Narrative collaboration with the Übersee Museum in Bremen and Digital Pacific. And Stacey was one of the commissioned artists and created an art piece on a choice of item from Digital Pacific. And I'm going to turn my camera off because I get really emotional watching this. So I hope you all enjoy.
E āriki te wairua ka moe au. Kia rangatira koe, kia rangatira au. Ko au te tumu enoa, ko au te moana uri uri. I aka mā ara, i aka mā ara. Adopt the spirit of peace to dignify your soul. Thus I am dignified. I am the land, I am the wide ocean. Remember, remember. I recite poetry from the late Cook Islands poet Kauraka Kauraka, from his poem Akamaara, that describes the importance of remembering our origins and how empowering others empowers ourselves. We are bound. Anyway, I said I would write about the atua, what are sometimes called God sticks in English, but the story is sad. There is no way to take the narrative that doesn't end with my heart being broken over and over. So I go back to the website Digital Pacific, where I've been asked to choose one object to draw inspiration to create. I draw from a group that has always inspired me and driven me to be, do and create more, and search the site for Cook Islands Woman. There are hundreds of results. Half of them are images, faces that look blankly at me from across years, decades. I scan through the titles of hundreds of photographs. Too Young Rarotongan Woman, 1903. Although the postcard caption says Native Bells, Rarotonga, kept in the Auckland libraries. Cook Islands Woman with Sylvester Lambert, also kept in the UC San Diego's Special Collections and Archives. 3 Woman, Cook Islands, kept in the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. The search literally gives me what I ask for, although sometimes I question how far into womanhood some of these people are. For the most part, no further information is ever given on the woman in these photos. The image descriptions usually give more detail on the photographer, but I wade through them anyway. At first I'm bemused, and then I'm bored, and then I start to question, is this all we are to you? Invisible lens holder pointing your camera at us. Are we not worth naming? In the words of Cook Islands poet Audrey Brown, do we not tell a story of a somebody and a somewhere that someone still loves? Digital Pacific reveals that the images, words, crafts and likenesses of hundreds of Cook Islands women are stored by 20 organisations across New Zealand, the United States and Australia. There's something about these objects that make me feel lost, that there's no compass to guide my searching. So I turn to one of the project organisers, Taputu. When we meet, we go through the Cook Islands custom of discussing our ties. What's your last name? What about your mum? Who were her parents? And what are their names? Where did they live? This series of questions is common among Cook Islands people, although I see now that they may seem almost invasive to the unaccustomed. This line of questioning derives from a cultural practice called Papaanga, which is often simply translated into English as genealogizing. However, Papaanga ara tangata represents a significant cultural practice for Cook Islanders. In formal settings, being able to recite genealogies gives one authority to speak for groups and provide expertise in subject areas. In informal settings, such as my conversation with Taputu, a knowledge of Papaanga enables people to articulate shared connections over space and time. Taputu quickly realizes that we share a relative, her grandfather being my great-grandfather. I tell my newly discovered Auntie Taputu about the challenges I'm facing with this project. I feel discouraged and dehumanized when looking at these objects, and I can't pick one object without feeling I am betraying something somehow. She gives me an answer by asking a question. Have you looked for us? So I return to the site and enter Masters, the name Taputu and I are both tied to. One of the first results shows a photo of my mama Ere, my grandmother's first cousin who was raised as her sister, who then later raised my father through his teens. The entry is an oral history, and the photograph shows my auntie in her 80s at the time, standing at the dining room table, her hand resting on a notebook, and on the wall behind her, photographs of all the people she loves. Her expression suggests that she was about to say something. I scroll down the page and there is a comment titled Cousin. It's Taputu's mother, explaining her ties. This is my first cousin Ere Masters. Her father and my father were brothers. Her dad is Ned Masters, the youngest brother of my father Carl Masters. I know our uncle Te Araya was also a tailor. Maybe she learnt from him before she came to New Zealand. She has just celebrated her 90th birthday in Auckland. Happy birthday, Ere. I went to that celebration in Auckland. Te Araya, the brother the uncle mentioned, was my grandfather. And this is what the potential of metadata is. To articulate connections, to provide restorative akapapaanga to images and objects that arguably have removed the humanity from the people they represent. In this small corner of the internet, I find my people and my ties and names I know. The story of a somebody and a somewhere I still love. So now I come to my decision, the one object I choose, and it's this. I choose rito, coconut leaf fibre, this object. Arguably not the most glamorous object, not the object that would stop someone in their tracks in the gallery space. Just rolls of coconut fibre, they look so ordinary and crude. But for Wāine Māori is so full of potential. Because rito can be made into tāeri, for calling ourselves during formal occasions, but also a sign of wisdom and peace when held by chiefs or orators. Rito can be made into hats, our pare, to adorn our heads, the most sacred part of our body. I choose rito. Rito plucked from the heart of a coconut tree, our tree of life. The tree our people search for when in times of famine, to eat the flesh of the coconut and drink its water. The coconut providing oil and cream and food. The coconut husk providing fuel for our fires. The coconut palm leaves providing roofing for our homes, baskets to contain our food and belongings, and mats to sleep on. The coconut trunks, shaped into waka for travel and fishing. All these uses that our people have learnt over several lifetimes while dwelling in Te Moana Nui o Kiwa, the Pacific Ocean. The palms that are used for mats, baskets and roofing are easily sourced from short coconut trees, but the rito is different. Someone needs to climb up to the top of a grown palm and cut the youngest centre shoot. The rito is the centre, the softest, the greenest shoot. I choose rito. Strands of rito rendered by the soft hands of Wahine Māori, hands that feed, protect, caress and love. Rito that is woven, bound, and bound again into treasured objects. Bound into the shape of this pare that adorns my head on the most special of moments. It tells people that they look upon Wahine Māori with a spine held straight by the generations of Wahine Māori that precede her. I choose rito. I choose the long strands of coconut leaf fibre that bind these objects to me and me to these objects and these objects to Wahine Māori and Wahine Māori to me. And it is my hope that someday my mokopuna can choose rito too. Rito and display in museums with their multiple ties and bonds extending out from it as my mokopuna walk around it. My mokopuna able to see how rito is bound to Wahine Māori who weave with it, bound to the coconut tree, bound to the land and to the Pacific Ocean. Rito contextualized among the Wahine who have handled it, women with names, lands of origin, and people who love them. Rito found on digital spaces as conduits to connect to other places, people, and objects, celebrating the skills and resourcefulness of our Wahine Māori who bind with rito and are bound to other women and to our bound futurities. Rito as an expression of akapapa'anga ara tangata. I am Wahine Māori and I choose rito.
Thank you to Tapatu for those insights and tour of the user contribution feature of Digital Pacific, and to Stacey Corkor Balfour for sharing that vulnerable and quite powerful case study that speaks so loudly to the value of Digital Pacific through an artistic and personal lens. Thank you as well to our audience for sharing your responses to that powerful case study in the chat, and please do continue to keep your questions coming via the Q&A function. Our next presentation is from Jenny Ostini, Director of Trove Community Services. Jenny, thank you for turning on your camera and for sharing with us some details about Trove's long-standing relationship with volunteers.
Well, I have to start by apologising for any drilling you can hear. There are new stacks being built right behind me, and we can't avoid that. Yuma from Canberra, the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, we acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this nation, and we pay our respects to elders and the ancestors past and present. We are committed to honouring Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas, and their rich contribution to society. I'm going to start out by asking a question which, after this webinar so far, seems almost superfluous, which is, are online communities still relevant? I was at IFLA a couple of weeks ago, and the trend report was released, and they were saying that people are still seeking community connections online, and that there's a growth in online communities. And that's because these are outside the traditional power structures, outside institutions, and outside forms of government. And there's this great desire for people to be involved at that level. There's this increasing turn to closed communities to allow trust to grow and to meet people's need for privacy. And people are much more comfortable with remote working, remote playing, and remote community making. And these are all increasing. So that's what the trend report said. And our role is to support these new ways of connecting and provide the infrastructure for people to build things for themselves. I've been really honoured to join the team at Trove and was digging back in the history of its establishment. And it was established in 2009, a time of great hope and excitement for technology. For an idea of how far we've come, I thought, well, what was going on in technology then? And that was when Windows 7 was introduced, Chrome OS, Google Apps, data in the cloud was really hitting the news. It was the sinking of Pirate Bay. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 was released and was also that year the most pirated game. Avatar came out in 3D. The netbook was launched. Twitter played a role in Iranian protests and social media was seen as the great hope for our future. And trust actions started against tech giants. On the personal level, I was the mother of 3 small children living in rural Queensland and was using Trove to help our local historical society build up some of their records and think about how they were going to tell the story of where we lived. I won a Trove mug for that effort, little knowing that I would ever end up working at Trove. Trove was developed to allow crowdsourcing and community input, and it was all part of this hope and excitement for the future. It was focused on newspapers, and that remains the majority of online use because it cuts across all of our users, from local history to national to personal to professional study of the past. And looking back in the history, I was thinking about Rose Holly, who was manager of Trove in 2011, and there's a big feature in the Sydney Morning Herald, and it said that the key to engaging volunteers was trust. That if you give them a high level of responsibility, they repay that trust tenfold. That was what drove the formation of the idea that we could use volunteers to correct material on Trove. This was a time that a Hall of Fame was set up to gamify text correction and encourage volunteers. And it's been fascinating to see New Zealand also go that way. By 2011, an in-house estimation was made that text correction had already made a contribution of over $12 million to Trove. I could not find out how that was calculated, so I can't update that figure for you. But people were just really engaged. We got one email in 2011 from a very competitively minded volunteer who asked, how many lines do I have to correct to get to a certain rank? For example, 250, 200th, 150th, maybe even the top 100, top 50, top 25, etc. I'm currently leading my dad by 250 rankings and my brother by 350. So I have my eye on other goals. Maybe I could do 5,000 plus per month or hit the top 200 if my wife lets me. On the other hand, this passion and commitment made for really highly engaged and vocal volunteers. We had issues with volunteers complaining on the hour, every hour, that they couldn't save their corrections and that the system locked up. We were running a backup cron job every hour to save text corrections to the stats table. It was taking 12 minutes every hour and locking the database, and then people couldn't correct in that time and felt they were falling behind. The result of the outcome of that was changing it to once a day at 3 a.m. And then it took longer to update and locked out people who, that was their precious time at night correcting. So we would get complaints. And, you know, this is a sign of how passionate and engaged people were. And, you know, for our collaborators to be aware, we also had what we jokingly refer to as the text correction wars, where we had volunteers monitoring and reporting on each other's behaviours because of the competitive nature of it. And that required quite a lot of work to monitor and make sure that people were creating a safe place online for other people. And some of the steps that were taken when Trove went through the modernisation program between 2018 and 2020 were an attempt to mitigate this overly competitive nature. So one thing that changed then was no longer having the username on the last correction. This was a time when the term voluntroves was coined, as it was thought having a highly identifiable collective noun would give the flexibility to connect better with a wider range of Trove users and give them a sense of identity separate from their community, so a sense of identity in connection with the library. We still get a lot of feedback when changes are made. Recently, we removed the opportunity for users to have biographies because the ability to put live links was flagged as an active cyber risk. Feedback was robust, and we had to respond to that. There were also friendships made online where people met and shared tips. Facebook became a way of building community of users. We had a formal Facebook page, and that generated informal groups and special interest groups, like how to do family history. There are individuals and organizations who train voluntroves as part of their digital literacy and upskilling, or helping people to meet their community service obligations. A group of women volunteers in one such program talked about how they gained confidence, mental health benefits, finding groups with shared interests. And my personal favorite, a lady who said, "I retired too early. I've been really missing giving or helping others. I feel that I'm back to giving, doing this text correction and connecting with other people." Trove very early on made a decision to provide the infrastructure and the content and the ability to interact, but to let users and communities flourish independently. Beyond looking at like standard website analytics, we don't actually delve too deeply into what people use or why. Part of this is the volume and the nature and the complexity of the material online. But part of it is our decision about privacy and access to information. What we do know that we have internationally competitive numbers of people using the system, but the majority of the users are Australian, which means we are meeting our core mission, which is to tell Australian stories. We know that users are deeply engaged. Registered users stay online for 30 minutes and potentially longer because Google Analytics used to cut it off at 30 minutes and restart a session. We know that we have over 3,000 lines of text corrected every hour. We have 71 tags, we have 3 notes and a list corrected in that hour. Part of the giant machine that is Trove and the appetite of the people that use it mean that the machine has to keep being fed, and we also have to keep thinking of ways that to meet people's interests and needs. We're not sure if this is the chicken or the egg, but we do know that people do tend to use the newspapers more, but there's also a greater use of material other than newspapers as we add different types of material to Trove. This has really influenced us to focus on making manuscripts available and developing handwritten text recognition. This is really exciting, and it's hard to explain how exciting it is that you can keyword search within manuscripts now. And that's part of our goal, is to deliver material with which people can interact. You can search for content within the manuscripts, and you can text correct it in the same way as you can with newspapers. This has been a trial for us. It's now becoming BAU, but in 2023-24, almost 500,000 pages of handwritten text were digitized and added to Trove. We have 10,000 manuscript collections ranging from single books to hundreds of boxes. This is a way to support and nourish our communities who are hungry for materials. And as a social historian myself, it's exciting to see this wide range of materials, letters and diaries going online and being able to be found. If you're a fan of such books as Letters of Note, you can read a letter such as Prince Charles's apology to Dame Patty Menzies, where we learn that even royalty are subject to the vagaries of traffic, where he wrote, "I was so sad to miss seeing you on the occasion of Sir Robert's memorial service in Westminster Abbey, and even more for that, I succeeded in keeping you waiting for 15 minutes before the start of the service. It was unforgivable of me. My only excuse was being London was totally jammed that morning and nothing could move. I also apologise for reading the wrong lesson, but that was what I was given to read, and I fear there was a ridiculous misunderstanding between my office and the Australian High Commission." I find, and many of our users find things like that so fascinating to read. The other way that we are doing a lot of work to develop the material is our development and implementation of an Indigenous Cultural and Intellectual Property Protocol, ICIP, and obviously much too complicated to talk about at great length here. But we have custodianship over rich archival published pictorial and oral history collections documenting our First Nations people. And this protocol acknowledges and recognises the right of First Nations people to be seen as the primary guardians, interpreters, and decision makers of that heritage. So we're encouraging use of the collection in accordance with the protocol and with advice received from ICIP rights holders. Part of the work that we're doing now is identifying material containing ICIP in Trove. And that means not just identifying who owns the material and the rights, but building relationships with communities, both the communities who own it and people who want to use it. And it involves conversations with Trove users about how to access ICIP material and building trust across the whole community. And I'll just close here with saying, is there still a role for humans? We go to conferences, we meet other people working in libraries, and we talk about digitization and discovery. We talk about AI, we talk about library business. And this sometimes obscures the idea that humans and community and the relationships we build on and offline are not just valuable, but are vibrant and flourishing. What keeps us going is the understanding that library work is community work. It's not separate from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. We come now to the final part of our webinar, which began with a story Rachel told of the 1980s, and then Jenny has taken us briefly through technology in and around, I think it was 2009, Jenny said. And so to continue this conversation about the past, present, and future of these digital platforms, we come now to a panel discussion between Jenny, Kelly, and Tapatu. So panelists, if you could please turn on your cameras, and I will introduce Tim Kong, the Director of Digital Experience at the National Library of New Zealand, who will facilitate this panel session. Kia ora, Tim, and welcome, panel.
Kia ora tātou, Nissan Bulamanaka. Nice to see everyone. Thank you to Jenny, Tapatu, and Kelly for some excellent presentations, full range of stories on display, provocations, some incredible artists presenting, but also some deep dive on how a teacher makes use of our systems and services. So really exciting. There's been quite a few questions in the Q&A. And in the back channel, the panelists are going, "Wow, which one of these are we gonna have a look at?" We had a couple that we'd talked about before. So we've got about 7 or 8 minutes. So I think the first question, we'll try to condense them. If we don't answer all of your questions, we will have ways to sort of speak to the ones that have been asked. But one of the questions, and this is very topical, and I appreciate might be a little bit beyond sort of what maybe the Digital NZ or Digital Pacific or Trove spaces. But one of the questions that's come through in the Q&A is around AI. And again, if it doesn't sit within where you are, I see Tups lighting up. It'd be fascinating to hear maybe just even your personal reflections on the question in terms of being from libraries and what that means, but also deeply connected with communities and what that might mean to them, pros and or cons. But here's the question. How are collections approaching AI use of material, like these collections that are available online already? Are there concerns about third-party use, or does the open access to Pacific communities outweigh concerns? And for Pacific, you can just have the generic community. It's not just. So I guess when I read that, I go, what is the, my thought was, and to support each of you in answering is, in the face of AI and in the face of all of the technology challenge that is AI, what is the balance between open access and AI being an enabler or a disabler for our communities? Just what are your thoughts on that? And I'll leave it open.
I can go first if you like. I think in the context of the conversation between Debbie and Martin, where they talked about sort of the Pūrākau, the Māori histories, the iwi histories, I think a lot of those archives and a lot of those stories are being held back at the moment while people just consider what the implications of open access for those collections are, and also in terms of where various services are being held. So where around the world those the archives are sitting on the service are being held. So I think in terms of what I've noticed, there is a lot of deep conversation and thinking going on, and it's sort of, we're just waiting, well, various communities are waiting to see how things play out.
Sure. Thanks, Kelly. Tups or Jenny, any thoughts?
Okay, I'll try. So I think this has come up with Pacific communities quite a lot recently around AI and how the data is going to be used in the future. I did a project with the Cook Islands community about kind of capturing the different dialects of the Cook Islands. And one of the things that they said to me was, how are you going to ensure that no one's going to be using or misusing our collections or our knowledge in the future? And the only thing that I could kind of suggest at the moment, because we don't have an answer to it, is around adding our cultural knowledge labels to it. So I've been working with local contexts and just kind of ensuring that our communities have a say on how their knowledge will be used in the future. So they got to choose how their videos will be used. I don't know if it will help with AI, but at least they've got something attached to their knowledge in their videos that they've made a decision for themselves about it as well. So local context, and we're still having conversations about what we do about it and how we decide on what AI is going to be used for in the future.
Well, I'll follow up there and second what you've said, which is, you know, there is a huge risk and there is a huge potential, and we're being very cautious in looking at that. You know, there's a lot of hype, and just thinking about making very pragmatic decisions to see where some of it will land. And, you know, we have obligations beyond which many of the people who are spooking AI have. So, you know, obligations around government use of data, obligations around even such pragmatic things as how much of our server will it take if we allow access? You know, how many calls can we actually reasonably manage on our server? How do we make sure access is retained for everyone and not just for a very narrow group of people using it? So we're just taking slow steps to think about all of these things.
Absolutely. Thank you each of you. And I guess I reflect from my position inside NLNZ, I think, but more broadly, I think for the sector, I think if we, and I'm reflecting on each of the pieces that you've presented around community and what happens when community are able to access and what it enables in community. I think there's a fascinating default for us as institutions to say, if we bring on AI with all of the same liabilities and all the same defaults of the way we think about our collections, we will just continue to rebuild those same blocks to communities that currently exist. And I think that's really important. As you pointed out, Jenny, what can we afford? What can we afford to run, and how do we run it? And what is it to be in essentially a different relationship or a different trust relationship with mostly AI services that are provisioned by rather large tech companies. So yeah, a really interesting space, and I appreciate probably a lot of people in the call are aware of it, thinking of it as well. I've got about 1 more minute, I think, 2 more minutes on my clock. So I'm just going to go to one of my pre-planned messages, which the panel all had a chance to think about. And I just wanted, before I started, I just want to reflect so much on the things that you've spoken about, in which the richness or the rich experiences that emerge when we allow different contexts to connect with our collections and our holdings. And each of you had different examples of that, and it was really lovely. And I was thinking about what does that mean for how our institutions shift to not just being places of conservation, preservation, and protection, but essentially places that are hosts, and the people that are hosts of this and enable and support really lovely conversations and different types of questions to come at us as we make collections more available and discoverable. So the question, with that little setting saying thank you, the question I had for the panel was, if you had, let me scroll up because I lost it there, in 15 seconds, if you were leading your library or NISLA for a day, what is the one enduring thing that you would change in your institution and in our organizations that would enable and empower communities into the future? And I might go to you, Kelly, and then Jenny, and then Tups.
15 seconds. I guess for me, would be about bringing communities into the library spaces, connecting with them through events, and also internships, paid internships. So, with the goal of ensuring that our libraries reflected the communities that we serve.
Thanks. Jenny?
I think that I would say that we can talk library language to each other, but we can't talk it to people outside the library. So, and just for example, we talk about digital reproduction. No one knows what that means. It's a copy. So, things like that, just to make sure that we are connecting with our communities and it's a place where they see themselves and are not held distant from.
Absolutely, and I was reflecting on Stacey's comment. She talks about akapa'anga, and in our Western world we call it genealogy, and there's a whole industry. But what is it to centre that in the Cook Island experience? Thank you, Tups.
I'm very conscious that Rachel Easton is in the call and our National Librarian. For me, I would have a late night for the library or have it open in the weekends so that the people that need to come and see our collections are able to access it. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic responses, all the theoretical, the high level, and the eminently practical. Thank you, Tups. Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Kelly, for your contributions. I'll hand the floor back to Simon. Thank you.
Tim, I wondered if you wanted to answer your own question.
Oh,
sorry to put you on the spot.
I love how the three panelists. That's a good one. I think I was at a wonderful event last week hosted by Suliana Vea at our National Library here, where we brought the Fijian community in, and we had them looking at the Arns Westra collection, and I was tearing up a little bit during that event because these are collections over thousands of photos taken by one of New Zealand's preeminent social documentary photographers, which specifically say, unless otherwise said, these people are unidentified. So not only are Pacific people not visible in our collections, we articulate that they are unidentified. And in 2 hours, the community contributed a whole number of names to help identify and add to the metadata of these records. And I think at the same time, I was there as the acting national librarian. I was acknowledging this was a gift from the community, because all of that metadata, all of that knowledge now becomes ours, the institutions. And I think if I was to be the lead for the day, is as the institutions, we have to acknowledge that those gifts enable us. And in terms of reciprocating that risk, how do we continue to reach out and continue to enable those communities, not just take their knowledge and make it ours?
Thank you. It's a beautiful answer and observation. It just remains for me to thank you all for joining and for your enthusiasm and participation, and for those questions. This session has been recorded and will be sent to all registered attendees, along with additional resources to help continue this conversation, and so that you may stay informed about these pieces of library infrastructure, as well as future NASLA events like this one, and how to subscribe to our newsletter and keep in contact with us. Before I conclude, I'd especially like to acknowledge my colleague in Wellington, Abby Beatson, who has brought together such an interesting conversation and delivered it to you in this forum. So thank you to Abby, to our colleagues, our speakers and panelists, and again to all of you for joining us, and good afternoon.